Adrian's first breath was a sharp, burning gasp that tore through his lungs. He convulsed, his body writhing as if trying to reject the air itself. His chest heaved, each inhale scraping like shards of glass. The world around him was a blur of light and shadow, pulsating in nauseating waves. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, like dead weight strapped to his torso. Gradually, the blur sharpened. He was in a chamber, the walls smooth and iridescent, glowing faintly with hues that shifted from green to violet. The surface wasn't metal or plastic, but something else entirely, fleshy and alive, faintly throbbing in rhythm with his own labored breathing. A viscous liquid pooled beneath him, its coolness sending shivers across his skin. He realized he was naked, his body slick with the same fluid. Adrian's mind raced, but the memories came slowly, as if wading through a thick fog. Earth, the labs, the collapse, the final days. His last coherent thought before oblivion had been of the emergency protocol, stasis, a desperate attempt to preserve something, someone, before it was too late. But 400 years. The figure echoed in his mind, whispered telepathically by the beings now watching him. The figures loomed over him, their translucent bodies refracting the soft light like living prisms. They were impossibly tall, their limbs unnaturally long and slender, their fingers tapering into delicate, claw-like tips. Their faces were smooth and featureless, save for large, glistening eyes that seemed to peer directly into his soul. Their skin glowed faintly, their bioluminescence pulsating in a rhythm that Adrian couldn't help but find unnervingly intimate, as if tied to his own heartbeat. They did not speak, but their thoughts invaded his mind in a chorus of alien whispers, melding into a singular voice that was both soothing and oppressive. "Do not fear. You are safe. You are needed." Adrian recoiled, clutching his head as their presence overwhelmed him. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. He managed only a feeble crawl, his fingers slipping against the slick floor. The aliens did not move to restrain him. They simply watched, their heads tilting in unison with an unnatural grace. Who are you?" Adrian croaked, his voice raw and alien to his own ears. "We are the Zelath. We have saved you. You are the last." The word struck him harder than any physical blow. The last. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. He had known humanity's fate was dire. Wars, famine, the poison of their own greed and negligence. But to hear it spoken with such cold finality shattered something deep within him. The last. The end of everything. "No," Adrian muttered, shaking his head. His voice rose in desperation. "No, there were plans, colonies, preservation initiatives. There were others." The Zelath remained still, their silence more damning than any response. Their luminescent bodies dimmed slightly, a gesture that might have been pity. One of them stepped forward, extending a hand. Its fingers hovered just above his forehead, and Adrian flinched, but the touch never came. Instead, a flood of images filled his mind. Earth, barren and lifeless. The once blue skies choked with ash, cities crumbled into desolation, their ruins swallowed by encroaching wastelands. The seas, black and roiling, devoid of life. The bones of humanity scattered across a planet that could no longer sustain them. Adrian screamed, the sound tearing from his throat like an animal in pain. The images vanished, leaving him shaking, his body curled into itself on the floor. The Zelath watched, their bioluminescence flickering like a heartbeat, slowing to a deathly crawl. "You were chosen," the voice returned, softer now, almost tender. "Your knowledge can restore what was lost. Humanity can live again." Adrian's breath hitched. His mind clung to the words like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. Restore. Live again. It was why he had gone into stasis, why he had risked everything. But something in the Zelath's tone, something in the way they watched him, set his teeth on edge. I need answers," he managed, his voice trembling. "Why me? How did you find me? And what do you want?" The Zelath stepped back, their forms shimmering in unison like ripples across a still pond. They motioned for Adrian to rise, their thin arms sweeping toward the chamber's far wall. With great effort, he staggered to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. The air smelled faintly of iron, mixed with a sharp, acrid tang that made his throat tighten. The wall ahead of him shifted, peeling open like a wound, revealing muscle beneath. Beyond it lay a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls pulsating with faint light. The Zelath glided ahead, their movements soundless, their presence both inviting and oppressive. Adrian hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, to resist, but he had no choice. Not yet. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling arched like the inside of a cathedral. Strange devices filled the room, organic structures fused with technology that defied logic. Tubes snaked through the space, pulsating as thick, luminous fluid coursed through them. Pods lined the walls, their contents obscured by a milky haze. Adrian felt his stomach turn as he realized some of them contained shapes, human shapes, distorted and still. One of the Zelath turned to him, its voice pressing into his mind. "You carry the key." Adrian stared at it, confused. "Key? What are you talking about?" The alien gestured toward him, its claws tracing the air around his chest. "Your body. Preserved. Perfect. Humanity's legacy lies within." Adrian's hand went to his chest instinctively, his fingers brushing against his skin. It felt different, tighter, more elastic. Panic flared in his mind as he pressed harder, feeling something beneath the surface, a faint, pulsing rhythm that wasn't his own heartbeat. "What have you done to me?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What did you put inside me?" The Zelath's bioluminescence flared brightly, their response a single, haunting thought. "You are the beginning." Adrian's knees buckled as the weight of their words crushed him. His body trembled, his skin crawling with a sensation that wasn't entirely his own. He looked down at his hands, his breath catching as he noticed faint, glowing lines tracing his veins. The last, the beginning. A new humanity, born from him. But at what cost? Adrian's fingers hovered over the controls, reluctant to touch the alien console before him. The apparatus was unlike anything he had ever seen, living and mechanical in equal measure. Tubes coiled like veins through the structure, pulsating with a phosphorescent fluid that glowed faintly. Each movement of his hand seemed to awaken a response from the console, as though it anticipated his intentions. The Zelath watched silently from the periphery, their unblinking eyes fixed on him, their bioluminescent skin pulsing in a rhythm he found unnerving. He had always prided himself on his ability to adapt under pressure, but this was something else entirely. The laboratory they had provided was a grotesque amalgamation of life and machine, its surfaces soft and faintly warm to the touch. Instruments resembling oversized needles and translucent shells hung suspended from sinewy tendrils that seemed to grow out of the walls themselves. The air was thick, humid, carrying a faint metallic tang that burned the back of his throat. The room hummed faintly, a low, vibrating sound that he could feel in his bones. The Zelath had given him instructions, their thoughts flowing into his mind like invasive tendrils. Use the genetic material, restore the species. Adaptation ensures survival. Adrian clenched his jaw, staring at the samples before him. They weren't just genetic material. They were fragments of humanity's last hope, encoded in delicate strands of DNA. Some of the samples were pristine, preserved in tiny vials suspended in viscous gel. Others were decayed, their sequences damaged beyond recognition. The Zelath had provided their own genetic templates as patches, alien sequences designed to bridge the gaps in the corrupted human DNA. He hated it. To Adrian, the very idea was an abomination. The resulting hybrids would not be human. They would be something else entirely. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more about the Zelath's needs than humanity's survival. Still, he had little choice. If he refused, they might kill him, or worse, use his body for their own purposes. With trembling hands, Adrian began the work. The bioconsole responded to his touch with an unsettling familiarity. It pulsed beneath his fingers, the glowing veins writhing as he manipulated the samples. A pod lowered from the ceiling, its translucent shell exuding a faint, organic warmth. Adrian inserted the first sample, a vial containing DNA from a young woman whose name was lost to history. The console flared to life, the pod filling with a shimmering fluid that glowed faintly as the process began. Hours turned into days as Adrian worked tirelessly, his focus a fragile barrier against his growing dread. The first embryos began to take shape within the biopods, their forms faintly visible through the milky fluid. At first, they looked human, fragile clusters of cells growing rapidly under the Zelath's accelerated development process. But as they grew, Adrian began to notice subtle anomalies. Limbs too long for their size, skin that shimmered faintly, as if laced with bioluminescence. His unease deepened. The Zelath assured him these were minor adaptations, necessary for survival in a galaxy that had moved on without humanity. But Adrian knew better. These weren't adaptations, they were transformations. The first of his nightmares came after the fourth day. He dreamed of a figure standing over him, its body grotesquely elongated, its skin translucent and pulsing like the walls of the ship. It reached for him with hands that were no longer hands but tendrils, their tips splitting open to reveal hundreds of needle-like appendages. He awoke drenched in sweat, his breathing ragged. The Zelath were waiting for him outside his quarters, their expressions unreadable. Progress accelerates. Continue. they projected into his mind. He didn't mention the dream. He didn't need to. The lesions on his arms had already begun to spread. They were faint at first, glowing softly under the alien light. He had tried to hide them, but the Zelath were always watching. When he confronted them about it, their response was chilling in its simplicity. Adaptation is essential. You are changing as you must. Adrian retreated to the lab, his mind a storm of panic and fury. He knew he couldn't trust them, but he couldn't deny the changes in his own body. His senses were sharper now. He could hear the faintest vibrations in the air, feel the ship's organic pulse beneath his feet. But it came at a cost. His skin felt alien, taut and too smooth. His joints ached with every movement, his bones creaking as if under some invisible strain. By the end of the week, the embryos had grown to near maturity. Adrian stared at them through the pods, bile rising in his throat. They were human only in the vaguest sense. Their bodies were elongated, their skin translucent and marbled with faint, glowing veins. Their faces were twisted, their features stretched into something uncanny. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself this was a necessary compromise. But deep down, he knew the truth. These weren't humans. They were something new, something alien. The Zelath seemed pleased, their bioluminescence flickering in rhythmic waves as they inspected the embryos. Adrian couldn't bear to look at them. His mind was fraying, each waking moment filled with the echoes of his nightmares. The ship's walls seemed to whisper to him now, soft and wet, like the sound of flesh sliding against flesh. He had started to hear the slithering noise even when he was alone, the faint clicks and guttural hisses that seemed to come from nowhere. On the 9th day, Adrian discovered the hidden chamber. He had been following the sound, that faint, wet slithering that set his teeth on edge. It led him to a part of the ship he hadn't seen before, the walls narrowing into a corridor that pulsed with faint light. The air grew colder as he walked, his breath visible in the dim glow. At the end of the corridor, a membrane-like door parted for him, revealing a space that made his stomach churn. The chamber was massive, its walls lined with pods similar to the ones in his lab. But these were different. Their contents were deformed, twisted beyond recognition. Some held grotesque hybrids with elongated limbs and eyeless faces. Others contained little more than amorphous masses of flesh, their surfaces twitching as though still alive. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sound, the wet, slithering sound, was louder here, echoing through the chamber like a grotesque symphony. Adrian staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His eyes locked onto one pod in particular, a figure that looked almost human, its face contorted in a permanent scream. Its body was a mass of swollen, pulsating veins, its hands pressed against the glass as if pleading for release. He fled the chamber, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The Zelath were waiting for him when he returned to the lab, their eyes fixed on him with unnerving intensity. "Do not fear the past," they projected. "It is necessary for the future." Adrian didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was unraveling, and he could feel his body following suit. The lesions on his skin had spread to his chest now, glowing faintly in the dim light of the lab. His reflection in the bio-console was barely recognizable, his eyes hollow, his face pale and drawn. The embryos stirred in their pods, their glowing veins pulsing in unison. Adrian stared at them, his chest tightening with a terrible realization. He wasn't saving humanity. He was creating its replacement. Adrian's breath came in short, shallow bursts as he stumbled through the corridors of the Zelath ship. The walls seemed closer now, their pulsating surfaces tightening around him, flexing like the walls of some massive organism. The air was heavier, denser, filled with a metallic tang that stung his nostrils and coated his throat. His skin burned where the lesions had spread, glowing faintly even under his layers of clothing. He had long since abandoned the idea of hiding them. The Zelath already knew, their silent stares confirming their knowledge. He hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces. Those embryos, their features twisted and alien, their bodies pressed against the translucent membranes of their pods. And then there were the other images. The malformed figures in the hidden chamber, their faces frozen in eternal screams, their bodies warped into grotesque parodies of life. The sound of their muffled cries still echoed in his mind, blending with the slithering noises that seemed to follow him everywhere. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to focus. There had to be a way out of this, a way to stop what the Zelath were doing. But the ship was a labyrinth, its layout shifting as though it were alive. He could swear the corridors he walked down were changing behind him, twisting and closing like a throat, swallowing prey. He wasn't sure if it was real or if the madness clawing at his mind was finally taking hold. The Zelath had grown more invasive, their telepathic presence a constant pressure against his thoughts. They spoke to him in fragments now, cryptic and unsettling. You must not resist. The process is nearing completion. He tried to block them out, but it was impossible. Their thoughts wormed their way into his mind like parasites, spreading through his consciousness. Adrian's body was changing faster now. He could feel his bones shifting, cracking in subtle, agonizing ways as his muscles stretched unnaturally. His reflection in the bioconsole had become something unrecognizable. His eyes glowed faintly under the ship's light, his pupils slit-like, his skin translucent in places, the veins beneath glowing like the embryos he had created. He could feel the ship itself in ways he couldn't explain, the vibrations in the floor, the subtle changes in air pressure, the movement of its living walls. It was as if he were becoming a part of it. The thought made him sick. He returned to the lab, his sanctuary and his prison, and stared at the pods. The embryos had grown larger, their forms shifting beyond anything that could be called human. One of them opened its eyes, a milky, luminescent stare that made Adrian stumble back, bile rising in his throat. It blinked, its eyelids moving sideways like the Zelath's, and then pressed a clawed hand against the membrane, its elongated fingers twitching. Adrian turned away, unable to bear the sight. He had to act. The decision came to him as he worked, an idea born out of desperation and rage. He couldn't let the Zelath's experiment continue. Whatever they were creating, it wasn't humanity. It was a mockery, a corruption of everything they had been. He knew they wouldn't stop him. They needed him too much. They had said it themselves. You are the key. But Adrian wasn't going to be their pawn any longer. The tools were already in the lab, organic, alien machinery designed for creation but capable of destruction. He studied the biopods, noting the connections, the points where the pulsing tubes fed into the ship itself. It was all connected, part of a greater whole. If he could sever the connection, he could stop the process. He might even destroy the ship. He moved quickly, his hands trembling as he worked. He sliced through the veins feeding the pods, thick, viscous fluid spilling out in spurts. The ship seemed to shudder around him, a low, guttural groan reverberating through the walls. The embryos inside the pods twitched violently, their limbs flailing, their mouths opening in soundless screams. Adrian hesitated, his resolve faltering for a moment as he stared at them. They weren't human, but they were alive. They were his creations. "Not anymore," he muttered, slamming the tool into the final connection. The reaction was immediate. The pods began to collapse, their membranes tearing as the embryos inside thrashed wildly. The lab was filled with a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from the ship itself. The walls convulsed, and the floor buckled beneath Adrian's feet. He stumbled, his vision blurring as a wave of pain shot through his body. His lesions flared, glowing brighter than ever, and he felt something inside him shift. A sensation like tearing and regrowth all at once. The Zelath arrived moments later, their forms flickering in the dim light. Their bioluminescence pulsed erratically, their usual calm replaced with something Adrian could only describe as agitation. They didn't speak, but their thoughts flooded his mind in a chaotic torrent. "Why do you resist? This is the only way. You are vital to the future." Adrian backed away, his breathing ragged. "You lied to me," he spat. "This isn't about humanity. This is about you. You're using me, using us, to fix whatever's wrong with yourselves." The Zelath moved closer, their tall, sinewy bodies towering over him. One reached out, its claw-like fingers brushing against his temple. The flood of images returned, more vivid and horrifying than before. Adrian saw the Zelath's homeworld, a barren wasteland, its skies blackened, its oceans gone. He saw their bodies deteriorating, their forms breaking down into formless masses of flesh. And he saw their solution, humanity, stronger, adaptable, the perfect template to save their dying species. "No," Adrian whispered, his voice trembling. "I won't let you." He lunged for the console, his hands flying across the controls. The ship roared in response, its walls convulsing violently as alarms blared. The Zelath tried to stop him, their thoughts pressing into his mind, but Adrian fought back, his rage and despair fueling him. He activated the ship's core systems, destabilizing the biomatter that powered it. The room shook, and the lights flickered as the ship began to tear itself apart. But the cost was immediate. The ship was dying. Adrian could feel it all around him. The walls shuddered and convulsed, their bioluminescent glow fading in uneven bursts. The veins running along the surfaces darkened, the fluid within them slowing to a viscous crawl. A deep, guttural sound resonated through the corridors, a sound that wasn't mechanical but alive, like the death rattle of some enormous creature. The air was growing colder, thinner, each breath burning in Adrian's chest. He staggered forward, his body broken and alien, barely holding together. His legs bent unnaturally, his feet malformed into elongated, claw-like shapes that scraped against the organic floor. His hands, now grotesque and too large, twitched involuntarily. His skin glowed faintly, patches of it translucent and revealing a network of pulsating veins beneath. He could no longer recognize himself. Every movement sent sharp pain radiating through his body, as if it were fighting against itself. But he kept moving. The Zelath were no longer in his path. He had seen some of them collapse, their bioluminescence extinguished, their translucent forms convulsing as the ship failed. Others had retreated, their tall bodies slithering into unseen recesses of the vessel, leaving him alone with his own agony. Their thoughts no longer invaded his mind. Their voices, once omnipresent, were silent. Adrian reached the core, a vast chamber at the heart of the ship, its walls rising into an unending, pulsating cathedral of living tissue. The core itself loomed at the center, a massive, writhing structure of veins, sinew, and glowing nodules that pulsated in a fading rhythm. It was alive, barely, and Adrian could feel it tethered to him in some horrific, unholy way. He was part of it now, bound to the ship as much as the Zelath were. This was where it would end. He stumbled to the console, a grotesque amalgam of flesh and machine. His hands trembled as he worked, his claws tearing at the organic interfaces. The ship resisted him, the core's rhythms quickening as if in panic. Tendrils lashed out from the walls, coiling around his arms and legs, trying to pull him away. Adrian screamed, a raw, guttural sound as he fought against the restraints, ripping them from the walls with a strength that wasn't entirely his own. "You don't get to win," he growled, his voice distorted, barely human. "Not this time." He plunged his clawed hand into the console, tearing through the pulsating tissue and severing the veins that ran through it. The core let out a deafening, inhuman roar, the entire chamber convulsing violently. Adrian was thrown to the ground, his body slamming against the fleshy floor. Pain surged through him, but he forced himself up, dragging his broken form back to the console. The ship screamed around him, the sound rising in a crescendo of anguish. The walls split open, torrents of viscous fluid spilling out and flooding the chamber. Adrian ignored it, his focus singular. His hands, no longer entirely his own, worked with a precision that felt foreign, cutting deeper into the console, tearing apart its inner workings. The core's glow dimmed with each movement, its pulsations growing weaker. The ship began to collapse. The walls shuddered violently, entire sections of the chamber breaking apart and falling into the darkness below. The floor beneath Adrian cracked, and he fell, clutching at a fleshy tendril that kept him dangling over the abyss. Below him, he could see the remnants of the Zelath, their bodies tangled and broken, their bioluminescence extinguished. They were dying with their ship, their experiment undone. Adrian hauled himself back up, his claws digging into the living surface. He reached the console again, his body shaking, his vision blurring. He was running out of time. The core flickered, its glow reduced to a faint, erratic pulse. He pressed his clawed hand against it, feeling its weakening rhythms, and activated the final sequence. The core let out one last deafening roar, its light flaring so brightly that Adrian was blinded. The chamber shook violently, the walls collapsing inward, the floor splitting apart. Adrian felt the ship's life ebbing away, its connection to him severing piece by piece. And then it was over. Adrian lay on the fractured remains of the core chamber, his body broken and bleeding. The ship was silent now, its pulsations gone, its walls dark and still. He could feel the void closing in, the air thinning, the cold seeping into his bones. His transformation had slowed, his glowing veins dimming as his body began to fail. He looked at his hands, once human, now monstrous. His vision blurred with tears, though he couldn't tell if they were from relief or despair. He had done it. He had stopped them. But at what cost? There was no one left. No humans, no Earth, no future. Only him and the grotesque body he had become. The silence was deafening, broken only by his ragged breaths. He turned his gaze to the remains of the core, now nothing more than a mass of darkened veins and shattered tissue. His chest tightened with the weight of it all. He had been the last hope for humanity, and he had destroyed it. Destroyed everything. Adrian closed his eyes, his body growing still. He could feel the cold creeping over him, the edges of his consciousness slipping away. In his final moments, he thought of Earth, not the ruined wasteland he had seen in the Zelath's visions, but the Earth he remembered. The blue skies, the sound of the wind, the warmth of the sun on his face. And then, as the last flicker of light left his veins, Adrian Ross, the last human, was gone. In the void of space, the remains of the Zelath ship floated, a shattered husk of flesh and metal. There was no one to witness its demise, no one to tell the story of what had happened. And somewhere in the endless darkness, the universe moved on.